Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, Leadership Tip of the Week: Consistency is important. A discussion with Amy Thompson. Amy is the CEO of Creative Allies, based in North Carolina, USA. Question of the week: what is the history of introversion? And introvert myth of the week: introverts don't know how to have a good time. It's been another great week if you're a sports fan, with the Olympics. Now, you may have heard enough about them already. I've spent more of my time underwater this week, as not only has the weather been favourable, but also the tides, and that's my link to another news item this week. Did you read about the wobbling moon? I probably noticed it because I'm interested in the phases and the angles of the moon and the impact that has on tide, because of the effect it has on diving. But NASA scientists have apparently warned that the moon's angle relative to the equator is changing, and this wobble will make tides much higher than normal in the 2030s, with flooding that urban planners apparently need to be aware of. It's interesting, though, how small and almost imperceptible change can create such big ripples. So here's your question. As a leader, do you wobble almost imperceptibly? I've seen several leaders whose staff are always on edge, never produce as effectively as they want to because they never know quite which way the boss will be on any given day. The boss will ebb and flow like the tide, without considering the impact it can have on the team, especially in the way it affects some different personality types. So there's just a quick thought for your leadership style this week. Think about the wobbling moon. What would you like to know about introversion in business? This week's question comes from Lee, and Lee asked, what's the history of introversion? And it's a great question, but I'm thinking I'm going to have to give a very shortened answer to it though. Introversion and extroversion were introduced into psychology by Carl Jung in the 1920s in his book Psychological Types. I can't pronounce the German title, I'm afraid. Extroverted people are energized by social interactions, whereas those same engagements are energetically taxing for introverts, according to Jung. German-born, although British psychologist Hans Eysenck wrote a lot in the 40s and 50s and published and developed a model of personality focusing on extroversion in 1967. The behaviours of introverts and extroverts are due to differences in cortical arousal, the speed and amount of the brain's activity in Eysenck's theory. Compared with extroverts, introverts have a naturally high cortical arousal and may process more information per second. I've got to go on to add to this, though, that many of Eysenck's papers were controversial or deemed not compatible with modern science. They weren't all about introversion. Catherine Briggs started to research in 1919 into personality type theory. In 1962, there was another big step when her daughter, built on her work, her daughter was Isabel Briggs Myers, published the MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. This is a personality tool that's very popular, and one of the types it covers is I or E, introvert or extrovert. It's been developed a lot since that first publication in 1962, although there are some people that will still dispute its usefulness. Depew and Collins in the 80s and 90s researched into the sensitivity of introverts to dopamine and the link to stimulation, which I think goes some way to explain the energy thing. So there's a potted history of how it's developed. What question would you like answered on the show? Whether you want to be on the show or just have your question answered, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also follow on Facebook and discuss the answers at the show's page, Activate Your Introvert. But now it's time to chat with Amy. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you for having me, John.
Great to be with you and great to talk. We're going to talk a lot about your experience as a leader and as an employee when it comes to introverts. Just before we get into that, I'd really like to know, are you an introvert or an extrovert?
Yeah, I'm absolutely an introvert, and I am probably as far as you can get on the spectrum of being an introvert. That
Oh,
is,
wow. What's that meant to you in your career then?
I really didn't know much about introversion versus extroversion probably until my second job. And I worked at a really large pharmaceutical company that was very big on training. And they allowed us to take things like Myers Briggs and all of these other things, where I started to just learn more about what does that mean. I always knew my personality type, but I didn't really know there was a name for it. We did a lot of team building exercises, and just one thing in particular, I remember we had it's probably 15 or so people on our team, and we had the facilitator draw on the board where everybody fit. And it was me and one other person, and we were just by ourselves, introverts by ourselves. But I was definitely as far as possible on the line that she drew. And so to me, I'm different. It doesn't make me feel like there's anything bad about it. It just means I'm different and I enjoy being different. I was excited to finally have like a name that I could research and I could do instead of just thinking that I was different, without any explanation. So it was for me, it was a really cool learning experience when I was younger to understand what that word meant and what different qualities I had that were not like other people.
I've worked with many introverts who have come to me and they've described various, let's call it symptoms for a moment. And I've said, nothing wrong with you. You're just an introvert. And that's an amazing thing to be.
Yeah,
But as soon as they've got that, much like you said, as soon as they've got that label, if I can call it that for a moment, I'm okay then.
absolutely. And it's frustrating, I think, as an adult looking back on it, that we do that a lot, symptoms or, something that maybe is a little bit more negative, but it really is just the way that you think, your personality. But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with it. And so I feel good that I've been able to learn how to embrace it and learn how to use the way that I work well, the things I do naturally well, and how to use that to my advantage to build my career and now run my own business.
How did you use that introversion to your advantage when you were building your career?
I think it's about understanding, well, for me, it's about understanding what my strengths were. I am a really big nerd. I love taking tests. And so I really enjoyed the idea of taking the different personality tests and finding out those characteristics. What would I do if I wasn't getting paid? What are the things that I'm just naturally talented in? And then figuring out how could I either create a job or find a job that helped me shine in those areas. One of the things that frustrated me more than anything when I was young in my career was having managers who tried to fix me in a sense, right? Like, oh, you should be more like this.
Oh,
And it's like, luckily, I've always been a very confident person, but there are people who aren't that confident and they'll listen to that and they'll think that they have to change, how they behave and how they operate in order to get ahead. What for me, it was more of just learning what I was good at and then making sure that I looked for jobs or tried to find positions with managers that I could communicate really well in so that they put me in those positions and helped me shine instead of focusing so much on the areas that I wasn't strong in, right? And
that's really interesting. And so you had a number of managers, some of which who picked out the good things that you were doing and helped you to shine, and you performed well. Others of which focused on the weaknesses as they perceived them, told you to fix those.
that's right.
And that didn't work as well then.
No, and it certainly doesn't work as well for my attitude because it's like, why would you want me to do something that you already know I'm not good
Mm.
at? That doesn't make sense to me.
Later on, you set up your own company and you're the CEO of Creative Allies, which is a marketing company.
That's right.
How did you, as a right on the end of the line introvert, set up a marketing company where most people would say marketing is an extrovert activity?
It has been a really interesting journey. But a few years ago, I just decided I was tired of corporate America and just work, 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 and not really having anything to show for it other than money. Money is great, but that's certainly not the only thing that motivates me. So when I decided to run this company, it was certainly out of my comfort zone, but I felt like it was an opportunity to try something a little bit different. And what I realized is that it actually works wonderfully well with my strengths, right? It's actually not something where I'm constantly in big groups, which I hate, or having to, do a lot of talking to groups. It really is about one-on-one helping the customer. I've found that, wait a minute, I'm really good at this because people, you've heard this before, people buy from people they like, people buy from people they trust. And I know that I'm a likable person and I'm trustworthy if it's one-on-one, that's very easy for me to demonstrate. So I actually do really well with clients and do really well talking about my business in those small settings. So it actually is much better for me in my style and my personality than when I worked in a larger company where I was constantly a part of a bigger team and working with much larger clients, et cetera. Yeah. So I had to learn it, but I did take that kind of leap of faith a little bit. I didn't know this until I was in it, but I took that leap of faith to say I'm just going to give it a try. And what I found over the past couple of years is it's really a good match.
Oh, brilliant. If you look back then, what would you say the biggest two, perhaps three lessons that you learned as an employee that you would get other leaders to put into place?
I think the biggest thing for me is one of the biggest things is about as an employee knowing yourself. I think that's for an employee, for a business owner, but it's really knowing yourself. And on the surface, that sounds like, of course, I know myself, right? But it's studying, it's learning, it's reading up on your personality type, and then understanding who you work well with, because a lot of working relationships, so it's about compatibility. So who are the types of people that you actually work well with, collaborate well with? What are the types of roles that you would be most successful in? And that's a lot of, self-reflection. It's a lot of self-study. And most people, I don't think we take the time to do that. So that's certainly one piece of advice I would give. And then the second piece of advice I would give is don't let other people's opinions of how you should behave and who you should be dictate how you behave and who you should be. Like you really have to build that confidence in yourself. And everybody can't do this, but honestly, be okay with finding a different job or finding a different team if that person that you work for isn't out to make you the best you can be. They're more out to just make you like someone else.
So there you are now. You've gone through this experience as a very introverted employee. You've picked up a couple of great lessons on the way. So thank you for those. And now there you are as a CEO with staff of your own.
Yeah.
How does your experience as a leader now map onto all of this? That's where many people struggle,
Yeah.
both extrovert leaders who just don't understand introversion and even introverted leaders because their model for leadership is the one that they learnt, which is an extroverted model. So, what are you doing differently?
I think the biggest thing is talking, the communication piece, and really understanding both with the employees and with clients what's the best way that you communicate. As a leader, I do have to make more adjustments than my employees do. So if my employee needs X, Y, and Z, I have to make that adjustment to provide that so that they're successful. I can't just expect because I don't like certain things that my employees won't like it. So there is a pretty big adjustment you have to make, not so much being an extrovert, but just adjusting your style a little bit to make sure that you have your team feeling empowered and feeling like they can be successful. That was a hard thing to learn, but I think that's what helps.
Okay. And do you find it different to empower introverts and the way you go about that as opposed to when you're trying to empower extroverts?
I think so, because I think it's, what are the things that people are motivated by and how do people like to get information? So I have a small team, but I do have a person who has said to me very clearly, I'm an introvert. And so with her, it's actually a little bit easier because I know I can just be exactly myself and have those conversations with her. And I know where she's coming from on certain things. Whereas I have another employee that's clearly an extrovert. So I have to work harder to make sure that he has an environment that he feels like he can be successful in, knowing that some ways that he works are different than the way I work.
So we're coming towards the end of the discussion, Amy, but what I always ask my guests for at the end is a tip for an introvert and a tip for a non-introvert. So perhaps a tip for an introvert employee that would help them get more from themselves.
I think a big tip is being okay with being an introvert and being comfortable, being confident in that, and then acting accordingly. I would say that's the biggest tip for an introvert.
When you say acting accordingly, does that mean pretending or does that mean
Opposite, acting the way that you feel the most natural. And I know it probably sounds weird because you think other people won't accept that or they might not allow that, but I think more people are flexible. People are more flexible than we give them credit for. And I think if you are confident in you, other people around you will adjust to the way that you are. But you have to be comfortable and confident in that and not allow people who have bigger personalities like extroverts kind of dictate that for you.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. So rather than trying to pretend to be a confident extrovert, be yourself.
That's right.
Second tip then for a non-introvert, perhaps a non-introverted manager, how can they get more from their introverts?
I think getting to know people a little bit better. I would say one specific thing that I actually heard on one of your previous episodes. If you're in a team meeting, for example, I do not think on my feet quickly. I'm not somebody that likes to be put on the spot. I like to be prepared.
Mm.
So if you know that about me, if you get to know me a little bit, you won't just, Amy, what are you thinking? You won't just hop out and call. You might, before the meeting, say, hey, I'm going to touch on these topics and I would love to get your input. And then I could maybe have some notes or something like that. But as a manager, if you get to know your employees and how they operate, how they communicate, you can kind of tailor the way that you manage them and then get the best out of them and not make them feel like they're not being successful because they didn't answer the question on the spot in the right way or something like that, just as an example.
It's really interesting, Amy. I've loved this discussion, so thank you. But you've probably prepared more for it than many, many of the guests that I have on here. And I know that because we were chatting off air before we started. Again, what does that say? It comes back to what most introverts do, which they'll tend to prepare very well. Amy, just before we go, how can listeners get back in touch with you?
People can check out my company's website, which is creativeallies.com, or they can look for me on LinkedIn. It's just Amy. It is spelled a little differently, Amie Thompson, and you can search for me on LinkedIn there.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And now it's time for Introvert Myth of the Week. Those crazy stories that I hear and you hear that some people actually believe. This week's myth: introverts don't know how to have a good time. Yep, I fell apart laughing with this one. So sorry to those who want to believe this nonsense, but this is a total myth. Introverts, extroverts, and everybody in between can enjoy themselves. I guess have a good time depends on your definition, and I've certainly heard some strange phrases that go with that one. And the places I've most commonly heard this myth are from the type of people who believe in being loud and that it's their way or the highway. Simply put, we all have a different definition of a good time, so we all know how to have a good time. If you disagree with me, I'd love to hear from you. Perhaps we can even talk about it on the show. But I do know many, many introverts that I've researched and discussed this with who do have a good time. But here's the point. Maybe in a different way to the way that you think people should have a good time.
I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.